Hi, guys. We're going to continue our study of the philosophy of sex and love and friendship today by turning to the 20th century, and in particular turning to Freud. Freud is surely the author who has written about sex most rigorously and comprehensively, and we're going to read some selections from one of his most important works, the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, which was initially published in 1905. But before we talk about the book, I want to just get us back into thinking and talking about sexuality a bit in general. And I want you to start by just thinking about what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about sex and when you think about what sex is? Like, what do you think that word means? I think that most people think of sex as something that adults do. And it's something that, and most people think of it as something that a man and a woman do, and it's something that mostly revolves around genital intercourse. So those 3 things: adult, heterosexual, genital intercourse. I think those are the 3 things that most people associate with that word. And if you want to check up on that, just go to Google and look up the word sex and then look at images and see what comes up. I suspect that what you'll see, just as I did, is that the images are all a man and a woman, both adults, more or less naked in bed, clearly getting ready for genital intercourse. And let me go on about that point a bit more. That idea that that's what sex is so powerful in our culture, it seems to me, that people who deviate from that norm get in a lot of trouble. Right? So if you imagine sex to be something that doesn't happen between a man and a woman, right? If you're a man who wants to have sex with another man, or a woman who wants to have sex with another woman, even though that's much more culturally acceptable now than it was, some decades ago, that's still a site of an awful lot of tension and indeed an awful lot of violence. Take it a step farther. If you have people who don't straightforwardly identify with either the role of man or the role of woman in a kind of sexual way, or identify with what society takes to be the wrong one, if you don't identify in the way that people expect, that's an even more that's perceived as an even more intense violation of cultural norms. And again, it's often met with violence and all kinds of other oppression. So I say those things just to underline how powerful the phenomenon is of the popular view that sex is genital intercourse between heterosexual adults. And continuing on that theme of just this as a strong cultural expectation, strong cultural value, strong cultural view about what sex is. Think about movies and advertising. I mean, that is how sex is portrayed in movies, and that's what storylines revolve around, and that's how sex is portrayed in advertising, and that's what sells. So advertising and films again reflect this strong cultural view that that's what sex is. Well, we're going to come back in a little while to talk about that issue of heteronormativity, right? That is to say, the presumption that sex is supposed to be heterosexual and so on. We're going to come back to that a little bit later, but first I want to just focus on this issue of adulthood, right? Even if you're more open-minded about who can pair with who and how we identify ourselves as sexual beings and so on, it remains the case that most people think of sexuality as an adult thing. And I think what happens? Well, at puberty, your body changes a bit, and that's when sex becomes a thing. Well, what we're going to do now as we turn to Freud is investigate that question, basically investigate that issue, and basically challenge that view. So let me begin by reading from this book, the first paragraph of chapter 2, when Freud really gets into his study. And this is on page 39 of this book. Freud says, "One feature of the popular view of the sexual instinct is that it is absent in childhood and only awakens in the period of life described as puberty. Seems right. It's a pretty common view, right? But this, however, here's Freud's view. This, however, is not merely a simple error, but one that has had grave consequences. For it is mainly to this idea that we owe our present ignorance of the fundamental conditions of sexual life. So, what Freud is going to do is take that phenomenon of adult sexual experience and investigate it. In particular, he's going to investigate where it comes from. So the point he wants to make is that the way you experience sexuality as an adult is actually the result of a long process of development, that's been going on your whole life. And that the sexuality is not just a thing that suddenly pops on the scene at whatever, 16 or something like that, but rather that thing that's happening then is the latest stage of a development that's both psychological and physiological, that's basically been going on since you were born, since you were an infant. And this book is really the outlines of the study of that process of development. So what he wants to say is that sexuality is not just this single kind of monolithic thing, adults desiring genital intercourse with members of the opposite sex. Though that's the view we all got lodged in our heads, right? On the contrary, sexuality is at the core of our very development as persons. And indeed, in that way, what Freud is going to say is quite similar to the sorts of things that Diotima was saying in the symposium, in the sense that there's a deeper kind of driving force in human life. And the thing we normally think of as sex is one of its manifestations, right? And she called that eros. Well, Freud's going to talk about something similar. He's going to talk about libido, which is kind of life energy or sex drive, something like that. But just as Diotima said about eros, that it takes different forms, so Freud is saying that our libido takes different forms. And that thing we typically call sex is a particular form of that. But there are other forms of it, and that drive, that energy, has been developing through childhood. And so in that sense, there is a kind of childhood sexuality as well. So the particular thing that Freud wants to do then is show how our adult sexuality is a development of the childhood processes of sexual development. And in that sense, so show that there's a kind of sexuality present in childhood life. But also, very importantly, not to confuse that childhood sexuality with adult sexuality. So it's both the case that sexuality is not isolated up here in adulthood, but goes all the way back. But it's also the case that the forms it has back here are not the same as this. So what is sexuality in children then, if it's not that, as it surely isn't? What is sexuality in children? Well, that's the first question then that he tries to answer in that second essay, which is called Infantile Sexuality. He poses this question on page 46. He says, okay, what are we going to look for? So he says, people have often made the mistake of confusing the sexual and the genital, and we're not going to do that. We want to get away from thinking that sex is just about what happens with your genitals, as you will see. But he says that leads us to a question. He says, and the question is this is on page 46. We're going to ask, what is the general characteristic that enables us to recognize the sexual manifestations of children? So he's asking, what are the distinctive characteristics of childhood sexuality? And he answers that question over the next few pages, but he says it explicitly on pages 48 to 49. The bottom of 48, he says, we've now found the three essential characteristics of an infantile sexual manifestation. So at its origin, it attaches itself to one of the vital somatic functions. Somatic means bodily. So its origin is that it is attached to a vital bodily function. It as yet has no sexual object. That means it's not directed at something else, and it's thus autoerotic. It's a way of having a sexual relationship with yourself, basically. And its sexual aim, what it's trying to do, is dominated by an erotogenic zone, which means basically a part of your body that generates pleasurable feelings when stimulated. So the three essential features then have to do with an origin, an object, and an aim. The origin is that it's a somatic bodily function. That's where it originates. It's attached to that. The object is yourself. It's directed at yourself as the thing that you're working with, not something else. It's autoerotic. And its aim is to get pleasure from a stimulation of an erotogenic zone. Those are the three features of an infantile sexual manifestation, he says. And now he's going to go through and talk about the particular forms that these childhood sexual manifestations take. And you've no doubt heard of this before. We're going to talk about the famous oral stage, anal stage, and phallic stage. Anyway, so he says, let's going back to that first point about origin, right? In the child, this developing libido, this thing that by adulthood is going to take this desire for genital intercourse and whatever else, that thing that in its developed form is over there, in its initial form comes up in relationship to different kinds of bodily experiences. And basically on pages 64 to 66, he gives you an outline of the stages through which we develop. And basically, from the time a child is born up until the time it's about 1 year old, it goes through what he calls the oral stage. And that means the child's life kind of largely revolves around a thing that's happening with its mouth. And the particular thing the child is doing an awful lot, typically at that age, is nursing, getting milk from the mother's breast. And so Freud is saying, that experience there is the core of the child's developing psychological life. That's sort of where things are happening for the child. So it's a bodily activity, and it's a vital somatic function. That's getting nutrition. It's getting milk from the mother's breast. But it happens by a particular way. It happens by the child sucking, right? Using its mouth on the breast to get this. And he says, so the child has an experience of a particular kind of pleasure in that experience. From the point of view of the organism, it's getting nutrition. But the child isn't a nutritional scientist. It doesn't know it needs to get food. The child is oriented towards what it's desiring. And so it's hungry, I guess, so it's, that's part of its desire. But it desires this activity. It pursues this activity. So that activity of sucking at the breast is the most sort of engaging and important and sort of intense experience the child has. And that's the core, basically, of where the child's development is happening at that age. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in a second. I just want to quickly go through the stages. But that issue of sucking at the breast stops being the thing that children and parents are most sort of grappling with by about the age of 1. It varies with different children. But, if you raise a child, you see that different issues are on the table at different ages. And after the age of 1, there's a very good chance the child is not sucking at the breast any longer. It might be some children do it longer, some less. But after the age of 1, that's not so much the big thing that's happening. Usually, starting from age 1 to about age 3, the issue becomes much more dealing with peeing and pooping. And the thing that's really going to happen is the child is going to have to learn to control that in various ways and pee and poop on the pot, not just whenever it feels like it in its diapers and so on. And that's a big issue that children and parents deal with for a couple of years. And so Freud says that's actually the second big stage of this kind of development in children. He calls it the anal stage, and that's when the child is dealing with controlling that ability to excrete feces. Children get past that too, and after a certain age, that's not the big issue that children are dealing with either. And so then Freud identifies a third stage, which he calls the phallic stage, and he says that that's somewhere in the range of ages 3 to 6, somewhere in there. And what's happened is, the issue of sucking at the breast has been gone through as a big deal, but it's been done. The issue of learning how to control pooping has happened, and it was a big deal, and it's been done. Both of those sites, both of those activities, when they were happening, were, I guess, three things at the same time. They were a big part of like learning for the child, learning what his or her, their body is, learning how to deal with it. It was an issue of dealing with matters sort of in the world where you have to learn how to handle stuff right, like your parents are telling you poop on the pot or whatever, or your mom is saying, no, you can't suck at the breast anymore, and so on. Like you're navigating relationships with your parents, and issues are alive there. And also there are feelings of pleasure, right? There's a powerful kind of pleasure that comes from nursing, and there's a powerful kind of pleasure that comes from excreting, from releasing the stool and so on. So Freud says, yeah, you're dealing with all, the little kid is dealing with all those things. And for those ages, like that's kind of where it's at. That's the thing the kid is really dealing with. Look, the other stuff is going on too, but that's its sort of job as a developing person. But children get over that and they move on to something else. And in the phallic stage, he says, a new issue really comes up for children that was not an issue in those earlier years. And they start to, a different site starts to be a place that's pleasurable. They take pleasure in touching their genitals. They get pleasurable feelings there, and that's different from the pleasurable feelings that come from pooping or nursing. But especially what becomes an issue for children at this age is noticing sexual differentiation, right? Noticing, the biologist would say, some members of the human species produce eggs and some produce sperm, right? And so what the biologist calls the male and the female have to do with different roles in reproduction. So the child doesn't know about that, but the child does notice those differences in genitals, presumably by seeing its parents naked, possibly by seeing other children naked. And Freud says, that surely that happened in the years before there too, but it's really in this later period of child development that tends to become a psychological issue. The child is sort of working on something, and as you're raising your child, you can see different things are going on with children at different stages. And he says at this stage, you'll see that that's one of the things children are working with. Like, what does it mean that I have these kinds of genitals and somebody else has other ones? And so here again, there's a new kind of anatomical issue that's come to the child's attention. It's associated with different feelings of pleasure than either pooping or nursing, and it's associated with new issues sort of in grappling with the world. And I'm going to say that one, I'm going to go back and say something about the other ones too to lead up to it. So back at nursing, like, what was the real issue you're dealing with in the world? Well, it's really dependency. Right? The child, as a young child, the child gets really hungry, and it really needs mom there, or whatever's been substituted for mom, if it's a bottle for nursing, whatever. But the child really needs the relevant adult to give it that thing that's going to let it deal with this huge problem it's now facing of real intense hunger. So the part of the issue of nursing is that the child, Freud says, the child there is grappling with a pretty profound fact of dependency, and the nursing is about dealing with the hunger. It's about dealing with the pleasurable sensations of sucking and so on. But it's also being close to mom, right? So dependency, or whichever parent it is, whoever it is, the nurse who's taking care of the child. The dependency is the dependency on that person to take care of your hunger. But again, the child isn't a nutritional scientist. The child doesn't know anything about exactly the need for food. The child really deals with mom as the person who comes, or whoever, who deals with the problem and solves it, right? And so there's something similar that happens, with just having mom hold you and having mom there, right? So Freud says really that the oral stage, the first year of the child's life, is really about grappling with that issue of dependency, and that the need for it, and ideally finding you can depend on someone, your mom to take care of you, or your parents, whatever, and that goes hand in hand with the child learning about its body and learning about orality as a route to satisfaction. The anal stage, when the child is dealing with pooping, is really comes up. Well, the body has changed, and the child's ability to control its bowels and so on is a new thing, and that's why you train the child at this stage. But also, so physiologically there are changes, but also psychologically there are changes too. Typically at this stage, those issues of dependency will have been worked through enough. Ideally, they've been worked through well, and the child feels reasonably secure in that and so on. And the new thing that starts happening here is something much more like will and obedience and independence. Right? If that first stage is really about dependency and learning about that, here it's about the child starting to learn about its independence from its parents. Your parents obviously want you to poop in the toilet and not on the floor or not on the bed or whatever. And they can't make you do it. It's up to you. As you learn to control your body, it turns out it's up to you whether or not you're going to poop in the toilet, right? So here, the child starts to experience its independence, and indeed, in a certain way, the dependence of its parents on it. Like, people have to ask or try to order, but whatever. They have to ask the child to do this thing or tell it they want it to do it. And the child actually has the power here to obey or disobey, to cooperate or not to cooperate. So a new set of issues come up here, which are issues of self-reliance, and then the issue of how you're going to deal with other people's reliance upon you. So with these physiological developments, a new set of psychological and interpersonal issues are coming up here as well. And then in the third stage, the phallic stage, there, I said this is when the child is starting to focus on issues of genitals and genital difference and so on. And this is, and in that sense, what it is to be a girl or a boy, right? Here, a psychological issue that comes up also is, mom and dad, men and women and so on, how do I work out my identity in relationship to the kinds of identities they have? So here is also where the child is really going to be grappling with those issues of, am I a boy? Am I like dad? Am I a girl? Am I like mom? And if you grow up in a heterosexual family where mom and dad are the couple and they're sort of a pair, and they're a pair. So the question is, like, am I going to grow up like dad and like women like mom? Or the corresponding question for the girl would be, am I going to grow up like mom and like men like dad? And so the child is dealing here with really what it means to be a boy or a girl. And that is an issue of how it's going to identify with sort of models it has for what a person, what a man or a woman or a boy or girl or something like that could be. So that's a quick sketch of what happens in these stages, and that's basically the broad map of the development of a child from birth to about the age of 6, where there's this pairing of psychological and sort of interpersonal issues that are being navigated, where those issues sort of emerge in tandem with physiological changes that especially have to do with new things happening in the child's body, but especially the child learning to deal with its body in new ways. And these, as I said, these are the issues that take place up until about the age of 6. And then somewhere around the age of 6, a kind of interesting thing happens. And again, I think this is the sort of thing that many parents would identify with. Prior to around the age of 5 or 6, which again is typically when children start going out into the public school and kindergarten and so on, before that, it really feels like this is a little kid you have at home that you got to be taking care of. And there's an awful lot of like this person becoming a sort of fully functional person. But somewhere around that age of 5 or 6, it really feels like, oh no, you got the full person now. This person's going to grow and develop, but you got the thing there. right? And that's more or less what Freud says. He says it's really in these ages up until somewhere around 5 or 6, through the oral, anal, and phallic stage, that the basic thing that it is to have a personality is developing, and that's the core stage where you kind of become a more or less a fully formed person. And then after that, of course, you're going to continue to grow, but the issues start changing. And so around the age of 6, Freud says a new thing develops, which he calls the latency period. And in that period, these issues of pleasure associated with the body and so on that he's been talking about, those that we've been calling the manifestations of childhood sexuality, those things seem to disappear into the background. So whereas in those earlier stages, a big issue for the child was dealing with its pleasures and pursuing them, and that was happening simultaneously with the development of a basic sort of sense of who that person is, developing the person's sort of ego. Here, at around the age of 6, that stuff's kind of settled, and it drops into the background, and now as the child develops, it just starts doing all kinds of stuff. You learn how to ride a bike, you learn how to swim, you go to school, you start learning math, you start learning reading, right? The child becomes oriented towards much more the things that we would think of as, the regular things that people do, right? It's not so much focused on itself as on the world, and also at that time, its sense of sort of right and wrong is what's really being cultivated. Of course, again, that's been an issue in those earlier stages of childhood life too. But now that really becomes an issue, the child developing on its own a sense of how it should behave. And that's what Freud calls superego. But he says that goes on now from, somewhere around the age of 5 or 6 up until the time of puberty. Because then, again, somewhere in those early teenage years, there's another kind of bodily change that happens, which is your body becomes capable of sexual reproduction. And he says at that point, typically a whole new set of psychological and interpersonal issues emerge too. And as your body changes, again, new kind of pleasure starts to emerge. And that's again, in the phallic stage, back as a little 3 or 4-year-old, we were talking about pleasure with your genitals and so on, but it wasn't the kind of genital pleasure that you deal with after puberty. Because when you have now become, in the biological sense, sexually mature, your sexual organs function in new ways, and a new kind of bodily pleasure becomes possible. And relating to that, your body changes, new pleasure becomes possible, and relating to that goes hand in hand with relating to a new set of issues in the world. And in particular here, this is when we start doing those things that in our popular views we call sex, right? This is the stage now where we do those things like seek out a new individual partner of our own outside of the family and seek our pleasure not... remember, the childhood sexual manifestations were autoerotic. They were ways you find pleasure in your own body. Well, now we seek pleasure in and through somebody else's body. We want to touch somebody else and we want them to touch us. And pleasure associated with the sexual organs becomes the big thing on our mind. And so genital intercourse becomes an issue. And that goes hand in hand then. If seeking an object that we're going to have genital intercourse with becomes an issue for us, that also means in a significant way leaving the family becomes an issue for us, right? We start developing an independent life as a separate individual with someone else who we've chosen as our object of desire, apart from those familial attachments. So that's the new kind of thing that happens. So I've talked about the basic stages that we go through, but again, remember that these are both psychological and physiological developments. And the reason I emphasize the psychological there is to emphasize that it's not automatic what's going to happen, right? These are issues where you, as a developing person, are having to grapple with things that you face. And so these are what Freud is identifying here is sort of it's almost like the steps or the stages a person has to go through to complete their development as a person. But it's not guaranteed how that development is going to go. That's going to depend on how you get through that is going to depend an awful lot on the kinds of circumstances you're presented with, and how you then are able to navigate these issues that are sort of thrown at you by your body, but also by the people around you in the surrounding world and so on. So, in the rest of the natural world, we think more or less that beavers and rabbits are just going to develop on their own to be fully formed beavers and rabbits, and everything's going to go, naturally. And we would like it probably that we would just develop naturally too, but we don't. We don't just turn into fully formed humans by nature in that same way. So there is something that kind of comes to us by nature, like in that, we need to eat, and it's convenient that we've been shaped such that we take pleasure in eating as a little kid, right? We need to poop, and it turns out we take pleasure in that. We need to reproduce. It turns out we take pleasure in the bodily activities necessary to bring that about, right? So, it is the case that our organism is such that we have psychological motivations, namely the feelings of pleasure, psychological motivations for pursuing those very activities that we as a natural organism need to continue and flourish and so on. But nonetheless, carrying out those things doesn't happen just naturally. We have to do it. And how we end up dealing with those things is the matter of our psychological development, and we don't all go through that the same way. And indeed, one of the things that Freud is most oriented towards studying, where his investigations all come from, is from noticing how unhappy people are and how many problems we have, and trying to understand where the problems in human life come from. And this is really, Freud's contribution is to try to show that the psychological problems we have can be understood when we trace them back to the issues we face in dealing with these stages of our healthy sexual development, where sexual means this development of libido or life energy through these psychological and physiological changes. So, go back to what I said about the stages, right? In the oral stage, you're dealing with dependency. In the anal stage, you're dealing with independence. And these things clearly are interpersonal as well, right? They're about how you deal with yourself in this relational sense. Dependency is something you're working out in relationship to mom and dad. Independence is something you're working out in relationship to mom and dad. So these things are always paired, the personal and the interpersonal in our development. In the phallic stage, we're dealing with identification, like how we're going to identify ourselves in the terms of the models for who a person could be that are presented to us, right? And so we're going through these things that are the formation of a human personality. And Freud says, in each of these stages, there are various, they are all basically forms of conflict, or implicit in all of them is the possibility of conflict, and the question is how we're going to get through that. And basically, we develop a healthy character by learning how to deal with those issues of dependency and independence and so on, learning how to deal with the issues of identification and so on. Right? We develop a healthy character by getting through those stages and being brought, with the help of our parents, being brought through the process of navigating those challenges. Where do our psychological problems come from? They come from getting hung up on those challenges, not getting through the conflicts of those stages well enough. And if we want to know, where the responsibility for that lies, well, largely it's going to be with what we've been presented with by our parents, right? And so in a way, this thing it gives you a kind of model for parenting. What you're dealing with a 1-year-old is that child's need, experience of dependency and need to for security. And so, do the parents of a 1-year-old give it that adequately? What's the 1 to 3-year-old dealing with? Well, the need to have an experience of themselves as a kind of independent will. There again, do parents allow the child sufficient experiences of autonomy and so on, and so on. So these are the challenges that are being dealt with by the child in those stages, and a healthy personality comes from getting through those stages well. Problems come when we don't get to navigate them well. The third one, the phallic stage, as I said, is about identification, and there, one of the big tensions is that's where Freud came to identify this thing he called the Oedipus complex. There, one of the big challenges is the desire that you have for your parents. Like, you want to be the important one for that person, and so this is a thing. Parents parents will surely recognize this from their own experience with children at that age. That children will sort of play favorites. They'll pair off one parent against the other. They'll try to win the affection of one parent and so on. And there's a real sense of who's on whose side that can develop in those circumstances. And so once again, the child is dealing with really big issues that are going to be crucially formative for that child's sense of, basically sexual identity. And that can be supported or hindered, right? That can be something that parents make a good circumstance for the child such that it gets through it, or it can be a place where hang-ups develop. So by the time you get to the puberty stage, where you're pursuing new partners, right, and you're going to, presumably engage in genital intercourse and so on, that's not a thing that just suddenly showed up on the map out of nowhere. That's now something that you're entering into on the basis of all of these things that happened before you. And so the way you take up that new set of issues that starts to arise at 13 or 15 or whenever those things come up, for different people, whenever those things come up, that's going to be the carrying forward of a torch, right? Something has already been going on, and it's not just like everything gets washed away and reset. It's that person who went through the oral, anal, and phallic stages, and then the latency period. That's the person who's now going to get handed a new set of issues at puberty. And how you deal with that is going to be carrying on how you were dealing with these other things. And so, there are things, if you imagine that model of, what you think is going to happen, this sort of adult sexuality, what that model sort of calls for is kind of the bringing together of all that stuff you've been working on as a child, bring it together and putting it on a new person. Like you're going to say, this is my love object. So all those ways you've learned to love through the oral and anal and phallic stages should now be like, okay, this is what it was for, right? And so Freud says, the cultivating or the development of adult sexuality has to do with the channeling of these different things, bringing them all together towards a single object. But it also means bringing together a couple of different things, right? In those earlier developments, like he says, there's kind of an affectionate side and a sensual side. Like you're dealing with bodily pleasures, and you're also dealing with your feelings of attachment to these people, your parents and so on. And both of those things also have to come together such that your affection for a particular person who becomes your sexual object comes together with your interest in fulfilling your sexual aims there, right? So all of those things are coming together here. And I guess the point I'm trying to bring out here is I'm trying to get you to see how that having of a sexual desire for another person, there's an awful lot packed into it, right? What's going on in there has got all this stuff feeding into it with all its good development or bad development, right? And so the thing that ends up being your experience of sexuality as an adult, a young adult, isn't just a thing that happened to you by nature like that. Oh, I was just born this way, or I'm just made this way, or anything like that. It is the product of this massive process of development that, and let me add one more important thing. This is not just about some side issue. Sex isn't just this sort of entertaining thing you do on the side and then the rest of your life goes on over here. What you're seeing there is the reflection of those core developments of your personality. Right? And so that's then the other thing that Freud is saying, like our sexuality isn't a diverting adult entertainment. It's at the very core of how we become persons. And again, you might go back and think about Aristotle for a minute, right? So, Aristotle was saying, we have these things in us, the pathe, he called them, right? Those non-logos parts of ourselves, the non-rational parts of ourselves that are nonetheless obedient to reason and so on. And the point was, have you developed your relationship to those aspects of yourself such that they now align with the demands of your logos or the demands of your reason? Well, that's just a quick reminder of what we said about Aristotle before. I just want to say, as Freud is saying something similar here, right? That there are all these things that are going on in you sort of under the surface that are your psychological development. And the question really is, how have those things developed? Did you become habituated to dealing with the issues that were raised for you from 0 to 6, from birth until about the ages of 6? Those issues that were raised with you by your developing body, the developing issues it raised for you, and those in the context of the issues of dealing with your family. Did you develop through all those things in a healthy way such that they're now ready to, such that they lay a foundation for like a healthy, happy adult sexuality and so on? Or on the contrary, in your adult sexuality, do we see played out ways in which those things didn't work out so smoothly? Right? And then again, because of this very way, we're seeing sexuality to be much more than just your pursuit of genital intercourse, right? We're also seeing then that your adult sexuality is not just reflected in what you do in your pursuit of genital intercourse, but it's also reflected in the hang-ups of your personality, right? As I said, that's one of the things that Freud is really trying to understand, like where our psychological problems come from, right? And so sexuality is not just this thing that happens with adults where they pursue genital intercourse with other adults and so on. Sexuality is the whole process of your psychological development. And that thing you do with other adults in bed is sort of the tip of an iceberg. It's the obvious thing that stands up over the surface that is itself part of this much bigger thing, which is your whole psychological world with all its hang-ups and troubles and so on. And I want to just add a couple of other things to that too. So that's the basic story about the development. But I want to just pick up on a couple of other things Freud says in this final chapter, chapter 3, on the transformations of puberty. I said that one of the things that's happening in the phallic stage is this thing he calls the Oedipus complex, right? That's where you're navigating with your desire to be the one who matters to your mom or to your dad or something like that. So that he doesn't actually talk directly about the Oedipus complex in the chapter. He has it in a footnote that I think he added later. But this is really what he's getting at in that chapter on incest, the section on incest. He talks about first of all, infantile anxiety right before that. And he says, the thing that really matters to the child is that you need your parents to love and care for you. And so you have experiences of anxiety when you feel like maybe they've abandoned you or maybe you're apart from them, right? Well, then that sort of gets magnified or transformed in the later stages, I guess in the phallic stage, with grappling with a kind of struggle over that, over, who your parents are going to pick and your competition with one parent for the affection of another and so on. So that section on infantile anxiety and the barrier against incest is basically about that way that in those early years the child is really grappling with its place in the loving eyes of its parents and so on. But then, and so he talks about the big effects those things have. Well, so there, what's really going to be shaped for you is how you develop a sense of your identity as a kind of a sexual being, like both in the sense of like, am I a boy or a girl or what, and also what other kind of thing am I attracted to? Am I attracted to other boys or other girls or whatever, right? And so there, all Freud is doing is identifying the processes by which those things come to be formed. But then, as he says, our society, this is in the next section now on what he calls the prevention of inversion. Our society has these really powerful values that I spoke about at the beginning that say men need to have genital intercourse with women and women need to have genital intercourse with men. And other stuff is a problem, right? That's a very strong societal picture. And that's what Freud says here. And he talks about that idea that there is this intense and massive social pressure to conform to those values. And basically, what he says is, for a lot of people, that's going to be fine. Like, you're going to go through this development and society's going to lay out a path for you, and it's not going to be that big a deal for a lot of people to fit into it. But it's going to be a big deal for a lot of other people who don't fit into it so well, right? And so he says, so what happens here? And he says, how is inversion, which is the word he uses for homosexuality? He says, how does society get rid of that? And he says, chief among these is the authoritative prohibition by society, right? That's one of the biggest factors at enforcing a kind of heterosexual value. And I want you to read this next sentence. He says, where inversion is not regarded as a crime, it will be found that it answers fully to the sexual inclinations of no small number of people. So in other words, he's saying, if you just let people go through these developments, lots of people are going to develop in such a way that they think, I'm a man, I want to have sex with men, or I'm a woman, I want to have sex with women, or something like that. That's just going to be how people develop, and it's going to be fully sexually satisfying for them. But there is this massive social force pushing against that. So I wanted you to see this and this idea so I started off by giving us that picture of society, and the first thing I wanted to talk about was his initial theme, that it's a mistake to identify sexuality just with adulthood. But then I wanted to pick up on this other theme, that we have this massive sense that normalcy is heterosexuality and so on. And the point Freud is making here is that's not going to be the case, or that's not going to be the automatic result that's going to come about by people's development. Many people's sexual development is going to lead them in other directions. And so that cultural vision turns out to be this very powerful force that really works against the sexual desires and sexual development of all kinds of people. And he says something else there kind of interesting about women too. He says, another big thing that's been going on in all of this is it's about learning how to be independent. And that's a theme that has come through these chapters, that you do have to navigate these conflicts, but that's good. You should be going through these things because you're basically learning how to be an independent person, and that's sort of what we're after. So the family should be the place where you're learning how to go on and be someone separate who leaves the family behind and so on. But he says that also doesn't happen for anybody. That there's a real disparity in how men and women are treated, and he talks here a little bit about how women are characteristically brought up in such a way that they don't get to have the same kinds of experiences of autonomy and independence that men have, with the result that they don't fully get to enter into autonomous adult sexual identities. So this is just a few things he says you might find very worthy of further exploration. We're going to go on and talk a little bit about civilization and its discontents, and there we'll understand more about our development and how that fits into broader issues of social life and so on.